This is Software Engineering Radio, the podcast for professional developers, on the web at se-radio.net. SE Radio brings you relevant and detailed discussions of software engineering topics at least once a month. SE Radio is brought to you by IEEE Software Magazine, online at computer.org/software.
Hello, this is Charles Anderson for Software Engineering Radio. Today we are talking to Mitchell Hashimoto of Hashi Corp. Mitchell is a software developer, web developer, operations engineer, and author. He has been creating and contributing to open source software for almost a decade, and he often speaks at conferences about his open source work. Mitchell is passionate about creating great DevOps tools. He is the founder of Hoshi Corp, which we will touch on later on in the show. Mitchell, is there anything you would like to add?
No, I think that's pretty descriptive, pretty good.
Great. Today we're going to be talking to Mitchell about the Vagrant project. Mitchell, welcome to Software Engineering Radio.
Thanks for having me. This is fun.
Okay, so at a high level, what is Vagrant?
So at a high level, Vagrant is a project that helps you create reproducible development environments. That's kind of the pitch, and the problem it's solving is really when you hire someone or start on a new project, how do you get rid of all the work and setting up your laptop or workstation to work on that project? And how do you make sure you do it correctly?
So the conditions that kind of led you to do this was the issue of onboarding new developers on a project?
Actually, the issue that led me to create it was the issue of onboarding myself onto multiple projects. So I built it in college, my later years in college, and I was a developer for a consultancy, just working remotely. And we, as a consultancy, we would see quite a few clients, sometimes at one time, and I would have to basically set up my machine to run their websites. And it might be a variety of technologies. It might be PHP on one side, it might be Ruby on Rails on another, it might be Python. And there's various databases, there's basically hundreds of thousands of these like permutations you could get. And for each client, I was getting frustrated because I would have to basically reset up my laptop. And the sad thing is the most efficient way for myself to do it at the time was to just re-image my machine. I just reinstalled the OS and started from almost scratch. And I was starting to get frustrated about this because it's so disruptive pretty much. And so I started looking into basically other solutions. I thought for sure someone had to have solved this already. I was kind of surprised that at least I couldn't find anything that I considered a solution. So I decided that there's really only two solutions I could think of. One was virtual machines and trying those out. And another was basically moving my development environments to the cloud or to remote servers. And this was still when AWS was pretty young, so I wasn't as familiar with it then, but I was a poor college student, so I decided to go with virtualization first because I had all the tools on my own laptop and didn't have to pay hourly or something. So that's how that got started.
Okay, great. Has the scope of Vagrant kind of grown over time?
I think the scope's always just been much larger than what the project has historically achieved. So I think our scope has always been repeatable, portable, lightweight, portable, repeatable development environments is kind of the slogan, I guess. And when we first started, we were definitely not flexible enough to make that claim in a broad scope, and we've just gotten better and better. And I think even, we're 4 years into the project now, even 4 years later, even though companies are using it, thousands of people are using it, we're still making that claim more and more accurate. For example, a couple months ago, we announced finally, after 4 years, first-class support for Windows development environments, for example. So for 4 years, basically Windows developers were not included in this broad goal of the project, and now they are.
Oh, great. That actually leads me into my next question, which is what platforms are supported for the developer's workstation?
So with something like Vagrant, where we put your development environment into we split it into, a host and a guest, and the guest might be in a virtual machine or a container or another machine. The host side can actually be, and has almost always been able to be any major operating system. So that is Mac, Linux, and Windows. So that has been that way for years. On the guest side, it's always been Linux to some degree, and nowadays almost any Linux distro is fine. BSDs, and more recently Mac and Windows. So I think today we've covered pretty much every platform, major platform that we can.
Oh, so for the guest, you have Unix-like systems, and now you also support Windows for the guest?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
That was the new thing a couple months ago, is finally supporting Windows as a guest.
Excellent. Is there any particular type of development that Vagrant is specifically intended for? For example, I noticed most of the tutorials seem to be centered around web applications.
Yeah, perhaps you got the gist of it when I explained the history of it, but it was really created initially out of the needs of developing web applications. So I think it fits very nicely into that. But to date, I've also seen it very successfully used for things such as embedded systems programming, as well as cross-platform testing, cross-platform desktop applications, and stuff like that. So it's really, nowadays, if I were to make it more generic, it's really when you want to be able to run something in another environment, pretty much.
Okay. If you had to guess, do you have a sense for what the breakdown of the usage of Vagrant would be between, say, developers? You mentioned testers. I would also think ops people might be using it as well.
Yeah, definitely. So the major breakdown is really ops and dev, and I can't really confidently put a number to that breakdown, but the use cases on both sides are actually quite a bit different, but also extremely popular on both sides. So on the developer side, you're worried about just working in a consistent environment that's running all your dependencies and running your application. And on the operations side, you're really just concerned about having a sandbox in order to test various configurations and automation scripts that you might be developing. The two kind of come together in a nice way where ops could use the sandbox to develop their automation and configurations, but then they could ship those same configurations to the developer side in order to run their software. So whenever Vagrant's adopted, you kind of see it come up on one side or the other, but over time it definitely almost always bleeds into the other org.
Okay, great. One final introductory question I feel compelled to ask is, how did the name Vagrant come about?
So the idea behind Vagrant, and perhaps I've been told that maybe this isn't the exact correct definition, but I didn't know at the time, but it's worked out fine, is that you aren't working in any permanent environments. You're constantly moving around to different basically work environments and different sort of tasks, and that's why it was named Vagrant.
Okay.
Because it encapsulates these different environments, basically.
Okay, great. I've always kind of wondered about that.
Yeah.
So let's talk a bit about the usage of Vagrant.
Sure.
So what is a developer's workflow like when using Vagrant versus installing applications natively on his own workstation?
So the workflow is actually why Vagrant is so popular, I think I've come to understand. So the nice thing is that Vagrant introduces, a common workflow no matter what technology is in use under the covers, whether you're running a Windows environment or a Mac environment or a Linux environment, or the language is Java or PHP. It's always the same. And that workflow is basically clone out your repository from source control or something. Then you type Vagrant up, hit enter, that one command goes off and creates everything you need to run, and then you should be good to go. There's the two other commands that are just necessary, you must know, is basically Vagrant SSH. That always will, in one command, without any authentication, typically will give you access to the underlying thing running your code, and then Vagrant Destroy, which is kind of what you want to run when you're at the end of the day or you screw something up. You run Vagrant Destroy, and that destroys all your development environment so that you can start over and run Vagrant up again.
All right. And so is this what you mean by the Tao of Vagrant?
Yeah, so the Tao of Vagrant is something I wrote for the Vagrant book that I wrote, and I got permission to extract it out and kind of make a blog post about it because people liked it so much. But the Tao of Vagrant is basically my high-level goals of how I imagined Vagrant to be used and how I wanted it to be used and how it is actually used. So yes, this is kind of what I'm talking about.
Okay. You mentioned the book. We will include links to the book and other material in the show notes.
Cool.
So just to clarify and drive the point home, the developer tools run on the host operating system. So for example, if I have an IDE or I don't know, a GUI client for my source control system. Those things all work on my local, my traditional developer machine, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. One of Vagrant's, from the beginning, core design principles was to not get in your way. So to that end, you continue to run your editor, browser, debug tools if possible, typically possible, but debug tools, source control tools, and so on, all as you have in the past. Nothing really changes there, or things change minimally. There's been other attempts to basically run everything in in a virtual machine, but it's a completely different workstation pretty much. And I found that when I first started creating Vagrant, and that's why I said, there were things I didn't really consider solutions because I wasn't looking to really change the way I worked so much as I was looking for a way to isolate my environments.
Okay. And that has the benefit then of, for example, if I have some IDE that I'm very comfortable with and it doesn't run on Linux or FreeBSD or whatever, I'd still use that on my developer's machine.
Yep, exactly. You should. If you're really productive with one system, and whether that system is an operating system or a specific IDE or terminal, you should continue to use those things.
And there's a shared folder where a set of files is shared between the developer's workstation and the guest operating system, right?
Yeah, the two key abstractions that make that sort of separation possible are the shared folders, which we actually in documentation call synced folders, and then the networking setup. So on the synced folder side, that's just some mechanism by which you could edit files on your machine and have those changes appear in the development environment, whether that's a virtual machine or cloud machine or something. The networking side of things, basically Vagrant tries to find a way to expose whether it's an IP or just a port or some way so that you could access the things that are running in that machine from your own browser and networking, your own tools that use the network.
Okay, excellent. Are the resource requirements for running a virtual machine, are those reasonable nowadays?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's funny. I mean, of course, I still get asked that. I'm not like upset at all that I get asked that. I just think it's kind of funny because I developed Vagrant 4 years ago and was running virtual machines 4 years ago, and my laptop today is certainly much better than it was 4 years ago. So yes, it's very good. You're not going to go forward and run 100 virtual machines. You're not going to really achieve that. But in general, in the common use cases, you're really only running one to a handful, and your machine can certainly handle that.
Okay, good. Yeah, we will later on. We'll touch on the idea of running multiple virtual machines there.
Sure. Yep.
In recent years, there have been some other open source tools for configuring a developer's machine with native apps. I'm familiar with the Boxen project from GitHub, or Thoughtbot has a project called Laptop. How does using Vagrant compare to using tools like that?
So I want to preface this with I haven't looked into or actually even heard of Laptop from Thoughtbot. So if anything I say is inaccurate there, I apologize. But I certainly have used Boxen and was part of the beta program for Boxen and ran it for a while. And so I do have some experience there. And basically, I think that, there's still a certain level of native things that you need on your laptop, like a terminal and a web browser and an editor. And the various, configurations for those things. We know developers can configure those for years and never finish. But I think that for running applications and running the development environments for actual applications and services still belongs inside some sort of isolation mechanism. And Vagrant, the power there, again, like I said before, is in the workflow and is really a common way to just run any sort of application in an isolated way. And so where I think Boxen and such break down is really when they tried to do that isolation of development environments for applications. So in Boxen's case, sorry to pick on this thing. Again, like I said, I used it with Vagrant for a long time and it was fine. But I think where it breaks down is really Boxen only sets up Mac machines and tells you to work in a certain way, but Vagrant, it tells you the workflow in a certain way, but then runs the same identically on Windows, Mac, Linux, and various versions of that. And I think that's better. So I think these things like Boxen are better for the initial set up my laptop for development-like work. And then really as part of that, it should be also install Vagrant for me automatically. And then once you get to that point of running the application and working on the application, it's just use the Vagrant workflow.
Okay, good. Yeah, I have also used Boxen a little bit, and one of the first tools I had it install was Vagrant. So
nice.
So let's kind of move into a little more technical details on Vagrant.
Sure.
So what are the components of a system that's being managed by Vagrant?
Okay, so the only required component is something we call a box. And the box is basically like the base image of what to create. And so for a virtual machine, that's basically an initial virtual machine that we have to copy to make our environment. And for AWS, that would be like an AMI. So that's all that's required. But then on top of that, you could layer things such as provisioners, which basically could be shell scripts or Chef or Puppet. And provisioners are just a mechanism to install software onto the machine. So Vagrant integrates with around 5 or 6 different popular ways to provision something. So it doesn't try to reinvent that wheel. It actually just tries to work with you there. I guess one thing that would also be required in addition to the box, but I always kind of skip because to me it's kind of obvious, but I realize it might not actually be obvious, is you do need something to run your isolation. So you do need a VirtualBox or a VMware or AWS or something to run it. But that seems obvious to me. And I think that's kind of it.
Okay, so the software that's running the virtual machine, that would be a provider?
Yeah, we call that internally we call that as part of the Vagrant configuration a provider, yeah.
Okay. So a box is a virtual machine image, like a VirtualBox virtual machine image, and then you've got some configuration and some metadata for Vagrant?
That's correct. So the virtual machine image, we do that because, actually the original version of Vagrant that was never released internally would install the OS for you every time, but that's actually really slow. So that even small operating system, you're talking about minutes usually to install an operating system. So we quickly eliminated that step with starting from an image, a base image, and that might just be a fresh installed operating system. But that image thing is basically just as fast as your disk could go. So especially nowadays with SSDs, which are great, that step's really fast. And then the metadata you mentioned is actually important. So the metadata, which contains things such as how much memory do we need, how many CPUs, what provisioners to run, how to set up networking, that all goes into this thing called a Vagrant file. And the Vagrant file is just a configuration file, a per project configuration file that goes into source control. And basically one person at least, but typically only one person has to just put forward the effort to create the initial Vagrant file. But once it's committed to version control, everyone that's part of that team and everyone who uses it pretty much benefits from it and just has to type Vagrant up to get it. And that Vagrant up just reads that configuration file, which tells Vagrant what's my box, what's my provider, and what metadata and provisioning and so on, and just does everything for you.
Okay. So on kind of a detailed level, without, I guess, getting into too many details, what exactly does Vagrant do versus what the VM provides? Is Vagrant sort of a manager or a conductor of these other components?
Yeah, a conductor is a good description. It's really orchestrates all the tasks that need to be done in order to create a single development environment, and also exposes to the user the workflow and interface to do that. So when I first created Vagrant, I used to get a lot of questions that were like, well, why don't I just script VirtualBox, or why don't I just create basically my own virtual machine images that I double click and things like this. And you could, but it's ignoring kind of a lot of the additional nitty gritty details and benefits that Vagrant handles for you. And one of those is cross-platform capabilities of setting up things like synced folders. So for example, VirtualBox shared folders are actually quite slow. So Vagrant on Windows might use Samba or SMB shared folders, and on Linux might use NFS instead of those shared folders. But if NFS isn't installed, or on Windows you don't have the privileges necessary to create network shares, then it'll always automatically fall back to things like VirtualBox shared folders. And that's really nice just from a setup standpoint, because you can be confident that if you distribute the development environment and run Vagrant up, that Vagrant's going to find some way to make it work, even if it's not the optimal way to make it work.
Oh, okay. So Vagrant has the ability to kind of consider the environment that it's running in, and then given the desire to do something like set up the synced folder, then kind of pick the best possible strategy for that?
Yeah, that's the obvious thing, but it actually does. There's a lot of details it does on inspecting its environment to do quite a few things. So, for example, for certain versions of VirtualBox, there are bugs on certain platforms, and Vagrant actually works around those bugs to make sure they work. For networking issues, like when you double click if you were to just use a virtual machine image and it said that it had a network thing that was mapped to a specific IP, and you just double clicked it and that IP happens to be taken, it typically fails silently and just doesn't set up that networking environment, whereas Vagrant has a lot of detection mechanisms to warn you or give you an error, and sometimes even autocorrect for you things such as networking collisions and so on.
Okay, so it's like many tools that when someone first looks at the problem, you say, oh, I could do that easily. But then the devil is in the details, and Vagrant takes care of a lot of those details for us.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Okay,
you mentioned earlier this scenario where you're running multiple virtual machines. So, if my production environment that I'm trying to reproduce for my development or testing purposes, I've got multiple hosts, like a web server, a database server, maybe an app server. Vagrant can manage all of those, create those virtual machines, wire them up appropriately?
Yeah, so if Vagrant has a feature called multi-machine built into it, and it was built specifically for this, is basically as part of a single Vagrant up, bring me up multiple development environments, and that was to represent things such as a web server and a database server being on separate machines. If you network them properly, they could communicate to each other. and so on. So really, you could create a little mini cluster of machines on your computer.
And then is there any limitation beyond the developer's machine in terms of its hardware? I would think RAM would be the primary issue.
Yeah, RAM is the primary issue, and the physical limitations are really all you'll run into. And on a modern machine, you'll be able to run maybe 4 comfortably and 6, but straining it, and 8 where you're going to start running into trouble. That's generally the guidelines they give people.
Wow, I had no idea it was that many.
Yeah, virtual machines are reasonably lightweight compared to what people think. You could get a Linux virtual machine down to using only a couple hundred megabytes of RAM, which is pretty cool.
Okay, and then you also support Docker as a provider.
Yep.
So for our listeners who may not be familiar, Docker is a Linux container system that virtualizes the environment where applications are running rather than virtualizing the entire operating system and physical host and whatnot. So it uses even less resources.
Yep.
Excellent. Here's a question I had early on when I was looking at Vagrant. So we've got the Basebox that could be, for example, a vanilla basic installation of Ubuntu, for example, or I could have already added, Apache, MySQL, etc. to it. How does one decide between what things are in the Basebox versus what things get installed at provisioning time?
It's a trade-off. So if something's installed at provisioning time, it's going to take more time. Whereas if something is just in the base image already, it'll just require a little bit extra disk copy time, which is usually much faster. So it's just kind of a trade-off, not only in terms of that, but also in terms of effort. So creating a base image is a lot more work than just adding a new provisioner or a new shell script to run. So it's a trade-off there, and you just kind of weigh these things and figure out where it makes sense. So what I usually recommend to people is when you first get started, just provision everything. Just install everything manually, not manually, but using the provisioner system in Vagrant on top of a bare bones box and get things going. And what you'll find really quickly for any non-trivial application is basically that eventually your Vagrant ups are going to start taking quite a long time. And as soon as they're taking a long enough time that they're threatening the benefit of Vagrant as a reproducible development environment thing, where you're afraid to basically Vagrant destroy because you know that to recreate it will take so long, at that point is really when you want to look into, okay, what can we move into a base image? And I know we're not talking about it now, or perhaps not even this talk, but just to drop the name, that's really why I created the tool Packer. Packer is a way to basically automate the creation of base images to make this much less painful and much more automatable.
Okay. Yeah, I wanted to touch on some of the other tools that you are working on a little later in this show. Would it be correct then to say one would start with a basic Basebox, provision it, at some point in time, maybe once the dust kind of settles and the environment's pretty stable and it's not changing a lot, then you might want to consider producing a new Basebox that has this stable core to it?
Yeah, that's correct, yeah.
And then the trade-off there is that then the provisioning time hopefully would go down dramatically, so that when a developer or a user types Vagrant up, you start the virtual machine and you run the provisioning. And so it would cut down on the provisioning time for that.
Yep.
Excellent. We talked mentioned earlier about operations people using Vagrant, and probably or possibly they're using a provisioning tool like Chef or Puppet. Are there any issues with kind of sharing configurations like that? Is that a desirable kind of goal to aim for, where the production configuration information is used also by the developers for configuring their Vagrant machines?
Yeah, definitely. That was actually an intended purpose of Vagrant, and it's not something you just get for free. You can't just point Chef or Puppet that works in production at Vagrant and have it work, usually, unless you really kind of over-optimize some things. But usually you just have to make a few changes to recognize you're in Vagrant and make some changes. So, for example, examples I use is how to configure things so they only listen on localhost or something like that, or how to skip monitoring tools because maybe you don't want the overhead of monitoring stuff and development and things like that. But the idea really is to share the automation you're using for production with development and really lower the burden of operations from creating developer workstations, because usually in many organizations that burden falls onto them as well.
Okay. How would you characterize the maturity of Vagrant, the project? Is it still in sort of the run fast and break things phase, or is it becoming more stable and slowing down perhaps?
Yeah, that's a hard question because functionally it's very stable. Like in terms of having the features you need to be highly productive with it and use it in almost any environment. It's been in use in real environments in both small and very large organizations for years now, and it's really ready for that. On the stability side, in terms of are we breaking things, we try not to, but once in a while we do, and it's really annoying. It's frustrating for me as well, and we're trying to improve the test suite there. But with a system that interacts with so many external systems, it's hard to make sure everything works. So, for example, we rarely get bugs that are because the core logic of Vagrant is wrong, and that almost never happens because the tests are very good there. The bugs we get are really, the new version of Vagrant doesn't work with this very old version of VirtualBox, or this version of Vagrant doesn't work with this new version of Ubuntu that was just released. Like, it can't set host names, or Puppet doesn't run here. Or recently we've had a bug where Puppet just deprecated something, and so now Vagrant basically is going to have to detect what version of Puppet you're running to use the right flags. Those are really where the bugs happen, and it's frustrating, but we do our best to keep that stable and keep things moving on. And really, we're still adding features, but a lot of the in between release bug fixes are really compatibility things with various versions of things, really.
Okay. You mentioned before multiple virtual machine providers like VirtualBox and VMware, and I suppose those are ways of expanding Vagrant's functionality or adding different options. What are some other ways to expand Vagrant's functionality?
So providers were just a way to abstract where your isolation runs. And the original use case of providers really was to not tie ourselves so much to the VirtualBox, because there are a lot of benefits to using some other systems like VMware. And so that was the original goal. And while solving that problem and building that solution, we discovered some other users of Vagrant really wanted to move the complexity of their product that they were working on had actually exceeded the ability to even run on a workstation, a laptop workstation. And they wanted to move to some sort of cloud environment instead, but they wanted to keep the same workflow, basically Vagrant up, Vagrant SSH, Vagrant destroy, keep using your same editor, stuff like that. So they kind of asked me, is this sort of thing possible? And I realized that with this provider system and a few changes, it actually is. So we do have things like cloud providers like AWS and Rackspace, and they're definitely less popular than VirtualBox or VMware, but they're there to serve a purpose, which is either on the ops side to work in an environment that is much more close to production if you use something like AWS, or on the dev side to be able to work on an application on a fairly slow machine and your local machine and then get some fairly good performance because perhaps your development environment is on a beefy machine in the cloud.
Okay. Now I'd like to shift gears and talk some business related things. Vagrant is an open source project, but you somewhat recently formed a company called Hashi Corp to work on Vagrant full time. Can you elaborate on your business model for Hoshi Corp?
Yeah, so it's important to know that Vagrant is open source and free, and Vagrant was never meant to be a business at all, and I really formed a business around it out of necessity because I was finding myself working a normal full-time job and then coming home and working 6 more hours on Vagrant until midnight or 1 a.m. and really it wasn't sustainable. So I really had to make a decision, and that decision was to try to work on Vagrant full time and build a business around it to support that. And so the business model initially was just to sell a VMware integration, kind of an open core thing, but I want to make sure I say that that's not really the long-term business model, but it was a means to an end to really quickly support myself. And so what I did was create a VMware integration so Vagrant can run the development environments on VMware, and made that totally commercial. And I think that's fair because VMware is also a totally commercial thing. But that alone has been able to basically sustain me and a couple employees, a few people total, to work on some stuff full time. The bigger goal of the company is really to just solve DevOps problems and build tools to solve problems. And so to that end, we've been releasing multiple open source projects to get towards that goal. And the ultimate business goal is not to have an open core thing or not just rely on support contracts, although we do that. But to really build, I consider the open source projects really Lego pieces. And we want to make all the Lego pieces free. But really what we found is businesses want to buy solutions. So on top of the Lego pieces, we really want to start building some solutions using those Lego pieces that solve a specific problem and then sell those as completely commercial software. So avoid open core and the confusion around that. Don't try to limit the open source thing versus a pro version or something like that. And really just create totally commercial, almost non-related things.
Okay. So I was going to ask you if there's a tension between the open source aspect of the project and the need for you to receive revenue to support yourself, but it sounds like you're very strongly on the open source side.
Yeah, I think there's tension, but it's not on the business side. It's really, the tension is really a personal one or just at our company because we really just want to work on the open source stuff all the time. And the business stuff is just something we have to do in order to continue towards our vision and continuing to build open source things. So a lot of the time, it's like, well, we want to work on this feature of Vagrant that we want to build, but we really should be working on this commercial thing that we need to ship. So that's where the tension is. But I would say in the open source community itself, I don't think there's much tension. Sometimes, people are kind of upset about the fact that the VMware plugin costs money or is closed source, but like I said, I've tried to justify that, and I think I'm justified in that decision. Yeah.
Okay. How big is the open source community around Vagrant, and what is the mix of work on Vagrant between you or Hashi Corp employees versus other members of the community?
The community around Vagrant is quite large. So the users, of course, there's a lot. We get many thousands of downloads per day. On the committer side, there's over 10 committers to Vagrant, and maybe a few of them are very active, and the rest once in a while pop in. If you break down the lines of code, I think Hashi Corp people have written probably 95+% of all the lines of code, but that's not to say that the contributions weren't important. We get hundreds of contributions for each release, and they're really important. And really, the way they're contributing that's so important is really that feed the version sprawl that I told you about before, where we have to support really crazy matrix of versions of providers, provisioners, operating systems, and the host and the guest. And it's crazy. And a lot of these contributions are things like, fix setting host name on this version of Red Hat Linux. And that's really helpful to us.
Have you been surprised by the uptake of Vagrant in the community?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm getting a little more used to it now after 4 years, but definitely, originally I was surprised. Of course, I wanted it to be popular or big, but the chance of that, is quite low, and it took Vagrant a long time to get popular. So I think the first 6 months Vagrant existed, it got a constant number of downloads in the low hundreds, and so it wasn't growing at all. And I had almost come to terms with the fact that it's cool, but clearly not cool enough. And then at some point it just kind of took off, and that was really shocking to me for a while. I mean, still to this day, that sometimes I use all these things from other companies, and when I find out those companies develop some of those things with Vagrant, it's kind of cool to hear and surprising.
Yeah, that does sound nice. What is Vagrant Cloud, and what problems does it solve?
So Vagrant Cloud was built to fulfill a couple feature requests, and one of the feature requests was official way to discover boxes for Vagrant, and then the other is a way to version boxes for Vagrant. So when you move to this model of installing things into the box, you want a way to be able to say your version's out of date and just run this command to update it. And Vagrant Cloud does those two things. It also supports some other features which are extremely cool, but primarily it's to augment the workflow of Vagrant. Vagrant doesn't require Vagrant Cloud, but the Vagrant workflow does get a lot better with it.
Vagrant is still free to use, correct?
A majority of Vagrant Cloud is free. It's really only private boxes that cost money. You need a subscription for. So for most users, Vagrant Cloud is still extremely valuable and free. And for organizations that are using Vagrant in a professional way, they have a way to support the project and also get some additional features that didn't exist before by paying a little bit.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. What are some other products or projects that Hashi Corp is working on? You mentioned already Packer.
Yeah, so we have, I think, 4 open source projects right now. So it's Vagrant, Packer, Surf, and Console. And we're really just focusing on projects, like I said, that solve DevOps problems. And we have a couple more coming out, as well as a couple commercial products coming out too. But just, I guess, a one-sentence description of each of these things is Packer gives you a way to create machine images from a single template. So much in the same way that you run Vagrant up, and there's no human interaction from that point forward to get your development environment. You run Packer build against the template, and then there's no human interaction, and then out the other side comes machine images. And these work with Vagrant, but also don't have to. So you could actually just create AMIs for production and things like that using Packer if you wanted. Then there's Surf. Surf is a little strange. It's more of a library or a building block, much more than the other tools. So I'm actually just going to skip that because it was really built on a step to build Console. So I'll just talk about that. Console is, in one sentence, service discovery and configuration made easy. So the problem is in our growing in modern operations, we just have a growing number of servers and services and virtual machines and containers and all these things. And as these things grow, it's getting really tricky to be able to do things like, how do I find the address and port of my Redis machine or my Postgres or this service or that service? And Console is a modern approach to how to answer these questions in a highly scalable way. And so, as you could tell, we're kind of moving away from Vagrant's initial goals, but we're still very much in the DevOps space, and we're moving away on purpose because we're really trying to solve some major DevOps problems that and we feel that Vagrant space is kind of well taken care of.
So the Vagrant problem is mostly solved, and now you're moving on to a bigger agenda within DevOps.
Yeah, I think people are pretty happy with Vagrant, and there have been. It's not like we're ignoring it. We've been shipping some major features in Vagrant. Like I said, a couple months ago, we shipped Windows, which was a long time coming and a long time in the works. And Vagrant Cloud just shipped a couple months ago too, and all these things. We're definitely not ignoring it, but we are not trying to shove additional problems. We're not trying to make Vagrant solve additional problems that it doesn't. That's not in its scope. So we are moving on. At the same time to build these other solutions.
Okay, excellent. It's about time that we wrap the show up a bit here. Are there any items I didn't cover that you think our listeners would like to know about?
No, I think you did a great job, covered everything we do.
Excellent. So what can our listeners do to help the Vagrant project?
The best way to help, when people ask this, they usually don't have a ton of time to help, so they're not asking to write big features or something. Really, the best way to help the Vagrant project is when use it, and when you find a problem, report a problem, and if things are going well or you found a way to do something, blog about it, tweet about it. Those are really the best way to help.
Okay. So where can people find out more information about Vagrant, and where can they follow you at?
So you can find more about Vagrant by just going to the Vagrant website at vagrantup.com. From there you can find outbound links to Hashi Corp and Vagrant blog and who's behind it and stuff like that. And you could follow me on Twitter, again, from the Vagrant site. You should be able to find me pretty well, but I go by the name Mitchell H with 2 L's there. Mitchell H, I go by that everywhere. So GitHub, Twitter, and all that stuff. So it's pretty easy to find me.
Okay, good. We'll include links to all of those items and, as I mentioned before, your book in the show notes. Mitchell, thank you for being on the show today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
For our listeners, we want to know what you think. Please go to iTunes and write a review of the show. This is Charles Anderson for Software Engineering Radio. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening to SE Radio, an educational program brought to you by IEEE Software Magazine. For more information about the podcast, including other episodes, visit our website at se-radio.net. To support us, you can advertise SE Radio by clicking the Dig, Reddit, Delicious, or Slashdot buttons on the site, or by talking about us on Facebook, Twitter, or your own blog. If you have feedback specific to an episode, please use the commenting feature on the site so that other listeners can respond to your comments as well. This and all other episodes of SE Radio is licensed under the Creative Commons 2.5 license. Please see the website for details. Thanks again for your support.